Hello, and thank you once again for joining us here at The Modern Maker. This episode is entirely about the sleeve for this doublet and how it should all go together. From basting it together and popping it into the body so that you can check the pitch and hang of the sleeve, to putting on the facing, interlining the cuff end, putting buttonholes in, lining the sleeve, all of it. And I'm really looking forward to it because I'm trying a new way of cramming as much information as possible into a single segment, and hopefully it won't be more than an hour long. But I feel like this doublet series has dragged out for way too many episodes. It's taken so long to get all this information to you, and I really want to find a way to streamline it. So this is an effort to find a better way to put more steps into one video and move forward a little bit faster so that we can move on to other garments, so that people can keep their interest, so that it takes less long-term effort for me to actually make them, since I've had a hard time getting videos out more than once a month, which I really apologize for, and I'm trying to find better ways of doing this. So bear with me. Thank you so much for your support and patronage, and I really appreciate your interest in my work. Now let's get stitching on some sleeves. Here we are at the table, beginning work on our sleeves. Now, when we cut them out, we cut the wool out first, and then we cut the linen lining to go along with them. And we cut the linen lining ever so slightly larger so that it just doesn't have any impact on the shape of the outer shell. It's just soft and it'll hang inside. Now that we're going to set aside for the moment. Here's our out sleeve, and here is the under sleeve. I have to unpin it. Okay, again, I'm going to set my lining aside. Have my sleeves here. Now these are quite wide at the top, and that's because we have a couple of choices with how we can stitch this sleeve. If we want to have gathering at the top, then we use a simple half dedo seam allowance down the sides, and then we'll have just a little bit of shirring at the top, similar to the sleeve that I'm wearing. You can see a little bit of gathering here at the top. Now, if perhaps we want a smooth fitting sleeve, one of the unique things about the proportion with which we cut the top of this sleeve is that if we use a full dedo width seam allowance, that pulls the size of the sleeve into something that should fit smoothly into the armhole. Now, I like to have a little bit of gathering at the top of my sleeve. I like to feel lots of freedom of movement in my clothes. I don't want to feel bound at all. I have a little bit of a claustrophobia issue, so for me it's important that since the body feels tight on the garment, at least the sleeve is nice and roomy, and that lessens the tendency for me to feel trapped inside my clothing. So, with that in mind, we're going to use a half dedo seam allowance on this, and we'll do a little bit of shirring at the top as we stitch it into the armhole. Something else to consider, in the book we had a wintertime construction for this doublet, which is very, very heavy, and we actually interlined the sleeves. But we're not going to do that on this because this sleeve is actually much softer and I want it to be more comfortable and not as heavy. If you're considering building something for summer, make sure that you think about leaving the interlining out of the sleeve. It's great for temperature considerations. One of the biggest problems that people have when they're making clothes is they end up with two left sleeves or two right sleeves, and that just won't do. So the first thing that I do in order to alleviate that, over the years I've just developed a habit with how I start making sleeves so that I stop myself from any tendency to make two of the wrong side. First of all, I'm looking at my twill fabric. My twill fabric here, if I look at this twill, it is running up and to the left, and that is the wrong side of the fabric. The right side of a regular twill or a serge, the weave of the fabric, the diagonal nature of the fabric should be running up and to the right. So I know that this is the right side of the cloth. So I'm going to lay these sleeves out, right sides up. That way I know I have a right and a left sleeve. It's very important. So I will now place the matching undersleeve along with them. So I'll put this sleeve here and this one here. Now I know for certain that I have a right and a left and that they are correct. So I'm just going to throw a pin in the wrist of each one, and this way I know that when I pick it up, it's a sign to me that I've got the right sides together and it's been checked for rightness and leftness, and I can move forward with what I'm doing. So I know my sleeves are going to fit. So I can just, because I've done this pattern so many times, so I could just backstitch these sleeves together and move on to the next step of putting on the doublet body and putting on the doublet sleeve and making sure that it hangs correctly. But if it's a new pattern for you and you haven't mastered this draft yet, the next step is going to be to baste the sleeves together. And then you can check the fit, check the length, check all of those important things. So let me grab some thread and a needle, and I'll baste together a sleeve and put on the doublet body and show you how to fit it on yourself. This is awkward. It is something that especially it can be very difficult if you're not used to looking at clothes and seeing how they wrinkle and hang. So keep this in mind as you fit yourself. Of course, in all instances, if you have a friend to help you fit a garment, so much the better. Let me grab some thread and let's get stitching. Okay, I have my linen basting thread here. I'm not going to tie a knot. It's always best to leave knots out for basting. Now I'm just going to match up my edges. And using a half dedo, I'm just going to baste it together. Now these stitches are kind of long, not tremendously long, but you know, long enough to hold it together, short enough to hold it together, long enough for it to be done quickly. So I took 2 stitches and then just one tiny little back stitch to lock the basting in place so that I don't have to worry about this basted seam coming undone while I'm fitting. And I'm just using a running stitch with this basting thread, something that is fast and simple. And I'm only going to do this with one sleeve because with that, I can transfer markings to the other sleeve to make sure that it hangs correctly. Now, I know a lot of people who, they'll come to me and they'll show off their sleeves and they will say things like, I set this sleeve 15 times to get it perfect. And I like this method that we're about to do because it gives you an opportunity to put your clothes on, hang your sleeve, and get the right pitch and alignment of the sleeve before it's ever sewn in, so that you really only have to do it once. Because let's face it, if you have to stitch a sleeve in 15 times to get it right, something is really inefficient about that process. It's definitely time to evaluate whether it's cut properly, whether your sleeve cap is sewn in properly. You have to really look at it. 15 times is a bit extreme. Okay, I'm leaving the bottom of this open because I know that I have a wrist opening. There will be a buttonhole in the bottom. So I'll leave that open a little bit at the bottom so that I can just decide how deep I want the wrist opening to be. Getting my stitch started. My singular back stitch to hold it in place. Remember, there's no knots. And just running stitch along the edge, approximately a half dedo seam allowance. In my case, a half dedo seam allowance is just between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 an inch. Just going to throw in one little back stitch at the end of this hind seam. That way it won't come open during the fitting. Okay, now for a fitting like this, when I press these seams, I'm pressing very lightly because if anything has to move, I don't want to have a hard crease that I can't get out later. So we'll steam it, we'll use the iron, we'll press very gently. Okay. Here we are at the iron. This is the hind seam that I'm going to press first. Now remember, we're just pressing really lightly to open the seam and to get it to hang where we want it to hang. But just know that I'm not pressing hard. With an iron that's this heavy, I'm holding the weight of the iron in my hand and not even putting the full weight of the iron down on the fabric. Okay, that's the hind seam. And now I'll roll this around on the sleeve board and I'll do the fore seam next. Now, for those of you who are on the smaller side of things, you may not be able to just pull the sleeve down the sleeve board in order to keep pressing the seam. You may have to turn the sleeve around so that you can get in there and do it. For example, you may be only able to press to the elbow. You might have to turn the sleeve and go up from the wrist. Okay. So our fore seam and hind seam have been gently pressed so that I can check the hang of the sleeve. So you can see these are very, very loose basted seams. Okay, I'm going to take my basting thread, I'm going to run a little bit of a gathering stitch across the top just to draw it in a little bit so that I can see where it goes. And then we'll put on the doublet and have a minute to look at it. So here I have run my gathering stitch. Now here's my center notch. It's a little hard to see, but we made that center notch when we cut this garment out. And so I have done approximately 1/12 of the chest to either side of center, and that's as far as I really want the gathering to go. So what I'll do next is I will just draw this up to reduce it by about 2.5 inches tops, and that's 5 or 6 centimeters. And then I'll take an extra stitch to give it a little bit of security, but that's as far as I need to go because this really doesn't need to be super strong. It doesn't need to be permanent. It just needs to be there so that I can check the way the sleeve hangs out of the armhole. Here's my doublet body, and I'm going to just pin the sleeve in place or even tack the sleeve in place if you need to. I think I'm just going to use pins so that it'll be quick. Now this is a right sleeve, so I'll find my center notch and I'll match that up with the shoulder seam because that's how it was patterned in the first place, is that it should match there. And I'm overlapping my cut edge here and the cut edge here, and I'm overlapping by approximately 1 dedo because it's a half dedo on each side. So I'm just placing it there. I'm putting my pins on the outside so that when I throw this on, I'm not going to stab myself or scratch myself with pins. And I will lay this in place most of the way around the top 2/3 of the armhole. When we get to the bottom, I will check to see if it matches up with the underarm of the garment, which it looks like it should. Looks pretty close. Just because I don't want to have any pins in my armpit. Getting stabbed there with a pin is not fun. Let me tell you, it's happened before. It is not an experience I want to repeat. Okay, so I've got my fore seam here. And I'll pin just a little bit further. So it looks like I've got some extra room. I can probably use more gathering. I've got a little bit of extra room here. So I'll gather this a little bit more at the top. And so I can probably go 1/8 on either side of center instead of 1/12. But I usually start with 1/12 because it's small, it's convenient, and depending on the thickness of your fabric, it can take up more than you think. So for now, I'm going to proceed with this fitting, knowing that I'm going to gather the sleeve a little bit tighter. But as long as the center is lined up properly, the sleeve should hang well. Let's go to the mirror and find out. Here we are. You can see that I have tied my doublet around my waist. I've unfastened the top portion of my suit, tied my doublet, and I've lowered it down to a low waist, like where I would wear a pair of modern jeans. And that's just to keep any of this bulky fabric out from my natural waist up here where this doublet is going to fit. So I've got lots of lining built up inside here. So it's a little bit on the snug side right now because the lining's buckling up inside. Once it's complete, it should fit nice and tight and quite well. So this is the hang of the sleeve as it is right now. And what it looks like to me is that it's rotated a little bit far forward. I think that I want to move, and the reason why I say it's rotated a little bit far forward is you see the opening here where my wrist is. It's kind of spinning toward the front just a little bit. You can see how the front wrist is hanging away from my hand slightly. That says to me that it's trying to twist inward a little bit too much and that I need to rotate it backwards just a little bit. So I'm saying probably about 1/2 inch back is the direction I'm going to go. So this notch here at the top, I'm going to move it toward the back 1/2 inch and rotate the whole thing just slightly and see if that frees up the placement of the elbow and the hang of the front of the sleeve. This is a much better hang for the sleeve. You can see that the main body of the sleeve hangs smooth and comes clean off of the top of the armhole. Our gathering is shifted slightly more toward the back and less in the front. If we put too much gathering here, then we'll end up with a deepening of these wrinkles. So we've squished the gathering just a little bit more toward the back. And you can see that the front of the wrist no longer hangs as far away from my actual body as it did before. Before it was hanging quite a bit away, and now it's resting comfortably. And you can see that the opening on the back of the sleeve at the wrist down here is now tending to roll slightly toward the back. Once it's buttoned up at the wrist, it'll hang perfectly on the arm. You can see Bergen's sleeve has an awful lot of room, but when seen from the front, it doesn't look quite as dramatic as it is from the side. You can see the hind seam going right up the arm and the back. I will probably pull the gathering up slightly more in the back just to move that hind seam just a tiny bit higher. You can see how complicated it is to fit yourself too. Like you just have to eyeball everything. And I can see where it's all sitting. And I like, when I lift my arm, I like where the seam falls on my wrist. When I put my arm down, I like the hang of the sleeve at the wrist. Once this is sewn evenly into the armhole, those gathers will hang beautifully off the top. So I think I'm ready to mark this as it comes off the garment. I'll make a little chalk mark as to where the seam now joins on and where the seams of the sleeve meet the body of the garment. And with those points, I'll be able to stitch it clean into the armhole and duplicate that on the other side by just measuring down from the top of the seam. So here is the body of the garment. You can see I've made a chalk mark at the hind seam location and the fore seam location. And then I made a mark on the sleeve where I'll match the shoulder seam to the top of the sleeve. And with those marks, I can easily smooth the sleeve into any position I need, and it should hang beautifully. So I'll transfer these markings to the other side, which is just a simple matter of measuring with whatever tool you've got. You can measure with a bada tape, you can measure with a regular ruler. So I'm measuring from the seam. I have 3 3/4 inches here. So I'll turn this around. I'll measure 3 3/4 inches from here. Now this does assume that the individual you're making for is symmetrical side to side. Now I know, since this doublet's for me, I personally know that yes, I am quite symmetrical side to side, so I'm not worried about a low shoulder or having to adjust in any way. I can just transfer the mark. If you know the person you're working for is asymmetrical, then it's very important that you set each sleeve separately and mark accordingly. This one is 6 1/4 inches from the shoulder seam. So I'll measure down here. I'll just pop this and yank it right out. Before I stitch, I'll take these back to the iron. I'll press them so that I have a nice clean surface on which to do it, and then I'll baste them and back stitch them the same way that we normally do. I've made a mark where I want my sleeve opening to be down at the wrist. So I know what that mark is. Now I'm going to stitch the 4 seam first on both sleeves, and then we're going to finish the cuff, and then we'll close the hind seam. The things we have to do down here with adding a small piece of interlining and working buttonholes, etc., are much easier to do when the sleeve is more or less flat. So because of that, we'll only stitch the front seam first on both sleeves, we'll work the cuff, and we'll close the back. In fact, you can even partially line the sleeve with it flat before you even sew the hind seam. And in many cases, that's how some period jackets are sewn. For now though, I'm going to start here. I'm going to take one little back stitch to secure my thread in place. And I'll do this basting a good distance away from the edge, maybe an inch or more. And that just holds the edges together while keeping all basting stitches out of the path of where my back stitched seam is going to go. So then I know I'm not going to nail any of these stitches in place. I can remove them easily. It is a temporary hold after all, this basting. Okay, that's done. Next, I'll go sit down at my stitching bench and I will back stitch this 4 seam closed. So we've gotten our 4 seams stitched and pressed open as it is right here. Now if you want to, you can stitch it open. We'll be putting some trim on it in a little bit. But before we do, I want to put the interlining into the bottom of the cuff. And we didn't interline the rest of the sleeve because we want it to stay soft. However, where we are going to have the wrist bottom, where we're going to have the buttonholes and just the end of the sleeve, we want it to be better supported. So for this area, we're going to cut an interlining. And what I've got here is I've got a scrap of linen fabric. This is kind of mid-weight. This is what you might make like a regular all-season shirt out of, or maybe a pair of pants. And I'm just going to place my sleeve right on top. And then I'll just cut around it. Now this is double layer, so I'm cutting one for each side. I'll cut there. I'll cut around the bottom. And as I do this, I'm trimming off some of the hairy bits at the bottom of the sleeve. And then I will trim up to here. Now I've got my little mark for where I want my wrist opening to extend. I'm just gonna put a little clip right there. Now I'm gonna remove this. I'm gonna fold this over, and I'm gonna go about a finger width above where my little clip was and just cut. Okay, that part's done. Now I can set aside one of these pieces that I don't need. So I'll just lay this in place here. And the first thing I'll do is I will tack it to this seam allowance here. So what I'll do is I'll fold this back. Let me throw a little pin right in here, and I'm putting this pin kind of in the seam itself, like right in the divot where the seam is. And then I'll fold this back. And then I will just baste through. Take one stitch to secure it. Now I'm feeling underneath for where my stitching is of my seam. I'll make these stitches a little small because they are permanent. So this isn't a long baste per se. I think my stitches are about 1/4 of an inch long. When I get to the bottom, I'll take 2 stitches in one place, cut the thread off. And I'll just go around the perimeter, again with a short baste so that it's permanent. And it's best if I work this from the outside. That way I know for certain that I'm getting my edges properly lined up. So I'm staying close to the edge. I'm going about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch, maybe 3 millimeters. And then I'll take an extra stitch at the corner, and then I'll turn and keep going. Okay, I'll take 2 stitches in one place, get that nice and secure, and then I'll... Now we have a nice well-stitched interfacing inside the sleeve. Now before I put the facing in and work the buttonholes, I want to put my two lines of trim down the foreseam of this sleeve. So I'm going to move over to the chair and grab my trim, and we'll stitch that on really quickly. Okay, the trim application is no different than how we've done it in the past. Again, especially for the long seams of the sleeve, it's much easier to do this while the garment's flat or while the sleeve is flat. I'm going to begin my stitching. I'm right here on the surface. I am just a scant 1/8 of an inch away from the actual line of the seam. And every so often, I'll make sure to take a back stitch just to keep it secure. Okay, that's pass number 1. Pass number 2 is exactly the same. Next, we'll just give this a quick press from the inside. Mostly we're doing it from the inside just to keep from damaging the trim. So just where the cuff is, I'll fold back my seam allowance width. I'll use my little block of wood to cool that down quickly and secure it in place. Press the other side. This will be done in a similar fashion to how we cut the interlining for the cuff. So I've just pressed this little area where I'm going to work. I'm lining up the selvages here so that I know I'm on grain. Facing for the wrist end can be cut either on the bias or on the straight grain. A margin, it's a little bit bigger than what our standard seam allowance is for this sleeve. And I'm just gonna make little chalk marks just slightly above where I've cut this line on the facing. Cut it out. All right, I'm done with my silk for the moment, so I'm gonna fold it up and put it away. I'm going to fold up the bottom edge. I'll fold it up here so that it's about 1/8 of an inch away from where the fold of the outer sleeve is. I want to set the lining slightly inside. But to start, I'll just give it some pins to hold it in place while I get everything positioned. And then I'll go through and baste it with the white basting thread and remove the pins. That way I don't have to fight the pins when I'm trying to actually stitch the facing in place. Here at this corner, instead of folding this flat against itself, I'm actually going to wrap the lining around the seam allowance as it folds up inside. This helps keep it nice and clean and gives me a good tidy corner. That's why we folded the bottom up last, is so that we could have this tidy corner. I want to make sure that I keep this flat because I don't want to sew the lining in too tight and then have the outside hang poorly because of it. So I'm putting my basting about 1/8 of an inch away from my folds. We'll start here, no knots, just one little back stitch to hold it in place. Okay, I've reached my corner. Now that it's based around the edges, I'll just go along the top. These are going to be long and coarse as well because they're totally temporary. Once I get the lining sewn in place, it will secure the top of this facing where it needs to be. So for now, I just want to be able to remove all of the pins and know that my facing is secure where it belongs. Most often in these videos, you've seen me use a pick stitch to finish facings and linings, and I think for the sake of variety and the sake of showing you a different technique, I'll use a felling stitch for this one. So right here where my clip is, I'm going to just put some stitches in and do a couple in one place, and then I'll start my felling. Now the felling stitch happens over the edge of the fabric, and the thread comes out, the needle goes in above the thread in the lower layer of fabric, between the layers, and then out through the facing fabric. I'm making these stitches small and tight so that I know this facing will not move. The wrist takes a lot of wear and tear, so I'm aware of that, and I'm making sure that I use small, secure stitches for this lining, and that way I have confidence that it will age well. I'm not going all the way through to the outside, though I am making sure that I catch the interlining layer that's in there. I can feel the heaviness of that stitch as I make sure that all those layers are tucked into what I'm doing here. I'm at the end here, and I'm just, again, taking 3 stitches in one place, and then I'm going to cut it off. Now that I'm done stitching the facing in place, I can remove my basting stitches. Here you can see my buttonholes. I've gone through and I've given the wrist opening a nice solid press so that I've got a good clean set of lines around here. So I'm doing these back stitches very small and very tight. They're no more than 1/8 of an inch away from the line that I drew for the buttonhole. Just a quick tutorial on stitching the foreseam of the lining. This is really very simple. We're doing it with a running stitch, a nice small tight running stitch. And we'll start at the wrist end of the sleeve. I've got this laid together. I'm not going to baste because these layers don't really shift very much when I'm stitching them. If you're worried that they're going to shift, go ahead and baste. But for now, I'm going to leave it free and just do it. So we know we have a facing at the bottom of the sleeve, and it's, it's about a hand span wide. So I'm going to start my stitching just a few inches above the bottom. I would say probably 4.5 inches. And I do have a knot in this thread because it's in the lining and I don't really care that there's a knot, but I'm still going to take a couple of stitches in one place to make it nice and secure. Then I'll begin my running stitches. Since I'm working without basting, I'm also checking that my far end isn't shifting, and I'm constantly just playing with the fabric to make sure that the cut edges are properly aligned. And now that I'm at the end, I will just take some back stitches going the other direction, just for an inch or so, and that will make sure that it's nice and secure, particularly at the top, where it's also a stress point. But really the rest of the foreseam I don't have to worry about. It's not a particularly overstressed seam, so it should be perfectly fine with a running stitch. I don't need to back stitch it, make it super tight and secure. I pressed my seam allowance open. I figure at this point you don't need me to show you how to press a seam. You can do that on your own. So I'm going to lay this lining in place here, and I'm going to match it up at the top first. Okay. So with that in place, and I'm literally just like 1/8 of an inch above this buttonhole is all I need. And I'll follow this fold over to the center, and I'm going to just give it a little pinch so that I have a finger crease. Then I'll take it to the iron, and I'll press this nice and clean. Okay. Just folded this up and back. I'm actually just going to leave the extra lining in there because if the garment ever has to change or is gifted to somebody else and needs adjustment, then we know that there's enough lining left inside there to do whatever needs to be done. I have my basting thread. Just gonna go right in, securing my basting, and then done. Now I'm going to go sit down at the sewing chair and grab my linen thread, and then I'll just stitch this in place. I'm just going to start stitching. Now over here we have our little notch where we cut out so that our seam allowance could be left free. I'm just going to tweak the lining up so that the fold of my lining meets exactly where that clip is. That way there won't be anything hanging below the stitching line when I go to close that seam. And as I approach the end over here, I'll do the same thing where I tweak the lining up ever so slightly so that it matches and meets up with the intersection where I put that clip in my out seam. And now that I'm done, I'll take a couple of stitches in one place and cut. So I have removed the basting that held the lining in place, and now I want to begin stitching the out seam, or the hind seam. I'll fold the sleeve right sides together. I'll keep the lining out of the way. And I'll take my needle and thread and I'll baste my seam together. And remember, when I baste a seam, once again, I do it somewhat far away from where I'm actually going to do the stitching, and that way I don't have to worry about my basting thread getting sewn in place. When we cut this out, we made a little notch, and I can see that that notch is lined up, so I know that my sleeve is going together well. If that notch wasn't lined up, I would have to go back and look for an area where I may have shifted one layer against another and gotten it misaligned. If a sleeve is misaligned, it doesn't hang well when it's worn, and that's why it's important to make sure that all of our notches are observed and used. Here we go. We're about to backstitch this hind seam. So as I've done in a couple of steps, I will start at the left end of the seam because I like to have control over the fabric. I'll take a couple of stitches in one place, and then I'll begin this back stitching going left to right in what in embroidery is called a stem stitch. And after a couple of inches of this, when I have gone far enough that I can control the fabric, I'll flip it over and I'll pull the needle through to the other side, and then I'll work a standard back stitch for the rest of the seam. I don't like continuing with the stem stitch because I feel like I don't get quite enough fabric caught on the back side when I'm working this direction. It shouldn't make a difference, but for me it does. Okay, now I'm going to turn over, needle plunge through to the other side. Work is turned. I'm getting to the end of the seam here. So I'm just being extra careful to make these stitches strong because this area is a stress point. It's the top of the wrist opening in the sleeve, so it's important that I make sure it's really secure. Now I'll reinforce this even more after the whole sleeve is complete by putting a little bar tack right across the top of the opening to make sure that it has something to take the stress of being open and closed or perhaps getting caught on something, which is typical with an opening of any type. So now I will turn the garment around and I'll close the lining seam. And this will do just the same as the foreseam. I'll use a running stitch. I will take a back stitch every couple of inches. Make sure that it stays nice and secure. Okay, let's begin. Taking my first stitch very carefully right in the intersection of all of those edges, the clip and the folded cuff to the inside. I'm taking several stitches in one place, and then I'll begin my running stitch. Okay. Then I'll cut, press, we'll move on to the trim. I've got the lining sticking out the bottom of the sleeve because in order for me to stitch, I have to start at the opening here, and I can't do that with the lining in the way, but I need to get down and around the cuff comfortably and carefully. So in order to do that, I have to have the lining pulled all the way out the wrist opening, like so, and that way I can get my hands up inside, and I have to crunch the entire sleeve up like this in order to start sewing trim on. So it's best if the lining is out of the way because there's an awful lot of fabric in my hand, and I could make a mistake if I'm not careful. Up from the back through the trim, get my knot on the back side, and I'm just going to use a running stitch to attach this trim. And it'll be awkward for the first few inches, again, because I don't have much in the way of fabric hanging off to control. But once I have a few more inches, then I can use the back of my hand to control the fabric that is to the right of where I'm stitching. In this case, I am also stitching all the way through the allowance on the inside because I'm using the stitching to keep the seam allowance open. You can see one of the things that I'm doing as I work is you will watch my left thumb. You can see that I'm pushing a slight amount of ease into the trim as I go, and that's because this seam has an outward curve, and I want to help accentuate that outward curve. If I allow the trim to be pulled too tight with my finger, then I might draw that seam in a little bit and pull it up too tight, and then it's not going to hang well. You can see how narrow this trim is. On a totally different note, I've noticed that a lot of people making period garments use some fairly wide trim. Now, if you look at garments that are trimmed in this fashion, the trims are very narrow. They're 1/8 of an inch wide at best. If you read through Patterns of Fashion 1560 to 1620 and actually look at the diagrams, you'll note that in the majority of cases, these trims are 1/8 of an inch wide, 3/16 of an inch wide. They're very, very narrow. And I think that once you put your mind in a place where you understand how small the decorations were, because these aren't meant to be seen from an audience, they're meant to be seen up close and in person. These aren't costumes, these are clothes. So again, just remembering that and remembering the experience of wearing them, you know that the details are quite small, and that is what makes them look more authentic. So now, because I'm at my wrist opening, I've stopped trying to go through the seam allowance, and I'm just going into the surface wool. And that means, because there's a lot of bulk of seam allowances beneath this area where I'm working, which is right at the top of the vent. So now I have to let go of the lining, and I have to switch to holding the open cuff. Now we're going to a place where if we go all the way through, our stitches holding the trim on will be visible. So I really want to be extra careful to only stitch through the top layer and maybe a little bit into the canvas that's underneath, because we did put linen behind this. So we have an extra couple of layers to catch with the needle, but we just want to be careful. We don't want to go too far. Okay, I'm turning this corner. So I'm going to pull up a generous amount of trim into almost a little pucker, and then I'm going to stitch that down, and that'll give me a nice sharp corner that doesn't draw the fabric in at all. And again, I'm trying to, as I work, I am making sure that I give the trim just a little bit of ease as I go over the surface, because I want the trim to naturally hold the shape like this. If the trim is too tight, then it'll be a tendency for this corner to curl out and for the trim to not, for the cuff to not sit properly. Okay. The opening is done. Now I need to get back into a position where the sleeve is crunched up in my hand, only this time the top of the sleeve is on the left, which makes it a little bit more convenient. I don't have to crunch both the sleeve and the lining up into my hand. I only have to hold the sleeve itself. We have all of the trim applied now to the hind seam except for one pass. If you look at all the seams, we've got a double row, and we have a double row on the shoulders, we have a double row on the side back seams, but now, because it splits and goes around the wrist, we only have a single row at the bottom. So the way this is accomplished is very often in surviving doublets, you'll see like a line of trim that goes to the outside of the buttonhole here, but then pairs up and goes around the rest of it as a second line so that it mirrors exactly what's happening here at the seam. So we're going to do that next. Going to start here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle underneath my current line of trim, and I'm going to drag this piece of trim through. This way it's buried. The end can be easily buried. And I'm going to come between my layers, and I'm coming up through this here. There we go. And now I'll go around the wrist. When I come up to the other side where the buttonholes are, then I'll go around the outside of the buttonholes versus the opening side of the buttonholes. So as I go around the bottom of the cuff again, I made sure to put extra ease in the corner as I turned. And now I'm just going to run along the edge here, leaving just a small gap between the lines of trim so that you can see that there's two. So now I'm going to turn the corner to go around the buttonholes. It's a little bit awkward. I think I'm going to have to stick my hand in the sleeve this way. And then I'm just running right along the edge of the buttonholes. In fact, the trim is partially covering the end tack of the buttonhole. And this way I can just get this nice, looks like about 1.25 inches distance between the edge and this line of trim. So also, if there's any small discrepancies in the size of your buttonhole, this visually evens everything up a little bit. All right, I'm going to cut this off, and again I'm going to slip underneath my trim here and bring the end through. Takes a little bit of fiddling to get it through. There. I use the needle to just pull a little loop through it. Now I can drag the rest of it through with my hand. Okay. So now what I'll do is, at this seam right here, I'm going to tuck the ends, cut the ends a little shorter, and then I'll tuck them in on each other and stitch them very securely. And when I'm done with that, I'll take the opportunity, since I'm right here at the top of the vent opening, I'll take the opportunity to make the bar tack that will secure the top of this. So as I'm stitching this, I'm stitching into the wool fabric beneath, but I'm wrapping my silk thread over the ends of the trim to join them. I've folded under, I've tacked the raw points, so now I've got this very strong, sturdy join for this bar tack. I'm going to slip my thread underneath the layers here. I'm going to take 3 stitches across the top of the opening. 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to use a buttonhole stitch and work my way across that bar. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to tunnel my thread through the layers to a different location. I'm going to exit and I'll clip close and it buries itself. Now I'll just take this over to the iron and give it a quick press. And when it closes, it should just overlap ever so slightly and the buttons will come through the holes. Now that the bottom of the sleeve is secure and complete, I'll grab my linen basting thread and I'll close the top of the sleeve. I'll just stitch the lining to the exterior just with a nice running stitch close to the edge just to seal it up and complete the sleeve. Okay, I'll begin at the hind seam. I'll just match the lining seam and the outer layer, and then just very carefully baste across it using a running stitch. And I'm doing this about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and the reason I'm going 1/4 of an inch instead of anything narrower is that this wool, again, as I've mentioned many times throughout the series of video, this wool is a little bit shreddy, and I don't want to lose the security by getting too close to the edge. As I work, I am trimming away some of the excess fuzziness of that wool just so that I have a nice clean sight line to what I'm doing. I'll work my way around, and this is just a running stitch to hold the lining to the shell. And then later, as I'm putting the sleeve into the armhole, I will worry about the gathers that I'm going to use to pull the top of the sleeve up. You can see it's just pretty basic running stitch, just lining up the edges and making sure everything is matched up. I have to ease the wool in a little bit in a couple of places because it has stretched out slightly just from working and being handled, but it's no big deal. It can be eased right back onto the lining, and it fits pretty close. Remember, they were cut at the same time, so they should be essentially the same shape. It's just a matter of convincing the fabrics to go back to where they belong. Okay, we are complete. That is one finished sleeve ready to be sewn on to the doublet. Stay tuned for the next time when we'll be getting the doublet body ready to have some sleeves sewn on.